Okay, I'm going to talk about a couple of issues that people are running into when they're getting started with 3D animation, especially animation that deals with keyframes, CG animation, although the principles that I'm talking about are not 3D specific, they're just animation principles. And the main thing that I want to be looking at is anticipation and especially follow-through. So in the case of a bouncing ball, the idea is that the mass, the weight, still has momentum as it hits the ground and can't just stop. Now, I'm going to be demonstrating with our ultimate ball rig, but the principles are applicable to whatever it is that you're animating, whether it is a ball or sphere or a rhombus or moose. They're all related. Okay, so let's get started. Here we've got a ball that's just bouncing up and down. Now, when it shoots off the beginning position, it is just being propelled immediately upward. There's nothing pushing it up. So we can kind of think of this as like it's a mid-bounce. So it's bouncing once after it's been dropped. But what we notice here is that it pretty much dies as soon as it hits the ground the second time. So there's no follow-through, which is the idea that this ball, with all this weight, with all this mass, as it hits the ground, it still has momentum. That energy has to go somewhere. Right now it's not going anywhere. The ground is sort of absorbing all of it. But what we want to do is have the bottom of the ball hit the ground first and then figure out a way to visually represent the middle and the top of the ball still having momentum, all that mass still moving downwards. This is just stopping. One way that we could do follow through is pretend like it's a bowling ball where it might have a little bit of bounce. So this is not bouncing a lot. There's not a ton of follow through. But that weight isn't just stopping like it is in the ball on the left. That momentum is bouncing back up and then adding a couple of little smaller bounces. That's the follow-through. Now another way that we can represent follow-through is by adding a little bit of squash. So in this example we can see that that weight from the middle and the top of the ball still has momentum and is still moving even though the bottom of the ball has hit the floor. So the bottom of the ball stops. It can't go through the floor unless the floor is made of something softer. But the top of the ball, still going, hasn't stopped yet. So all that weight is pushing the rest of the ball down and squashing it to visually represent mass that's still moving, that momentum. All right, let's look at these in the graph editor. So these first two are moving straight up, easing in and out of this peak position, and then picking up speed as they fall. The second ball does the same thing, it's just that it bounces back up. Now, remember when we're looking in the graph editor, we want these upside down U shapes. So this is the y-axis, this is representing height. It's shooting out of the low point, easing in and out of this top position, and then picking up speed to land at the bottom position. So this upside down U shape. Now if we don't have this U shape, if we have something that looks more like the default keyframes as for Maya is this either auto tangent or spline tangent. So this is no longer a U, this is a bell shape. So if we look at this first ball over here on the left, you can see that it's easing in and out of the low position. It's sort of like it's anticipating hitting the ground. But there's nothing that's making the momentum stop. There's nothing that's visibly slowing it down. So it feels wrong, especially at the end here. What we need to do is take this last keyframe when it's supposed to hit the ground, and we need to make sure that it's not easing into that position, but actually easing out of the top position and picking up momentum. We want that upside down U shape. So in Maya, I'm going to select this key. I'm going to make sure that that tangent is broken. This icon right here that I just clicked. It's like a regular V. So now this tangent is broken, which means that I can take the key, then select this handle, and middle mouse, click and drag that so that it makes more of that upside down U shape rather than easing out of that and then easing into that. So now it's still going to ease out of the start position, but it's not going to ease into the last position. So these other balls are doing the exact same thing. Upside down U shape with a couple of bounces, upside down U shape in this case with no bounce. The difference here with the ball that's squashing is in our ultimate ball rig, I've selected this top controller. It's not changing until the moment the bottom of the ball hits the ground. Now I want to represent the follow-through. How do I get it to visually seem like all this mass, all the weight for the middle and top of the ball is still moving? I've taken this top controller, and after the bottom of the ball hits the ground, I've animated that top controller farther down so that it squashes. So I just took it and I moved it down farther. Now how far down I move it is up to me. Just sort of depends on how I want that to feel. But you'll notice that the first key, when it's not squashed yet, doesn't ease out. And the idea is that that weight is still falling. There's nothing that's slowed it down yet. It's just like the main part of the ball. If we look at the graph editor, we can see that it's going from the peak position and then picking up speed faster, faster, faster until it hits the ground, at which point this sort of takes over. This shouldn't ease out. It should be moving very quickly, but it should ease into the low position because as it's squashing, it's meeting resistance with the rest of the ball. It doesn't want to squash, so it's meeting resistance, and eventually it's easing into the low position. And then it's easing out of that low position and then easing back into its sort of normal shape, its full spherical ball shape. So we'll play that back at speed. Now how long it bounces, squashes, how much it squashes, again, it's up to you. We could have it squash a little bit longer. Might feel like it's got a little bit more weight, more energy that's pushing into the ground. But we could play with the timing. So if I select the top control on this third ball and the top control on the fourth ball, I can see that really the only difference is the timing for this top control. They do happen to be hitting the low point at about the same time. Actually, I do like that a little bit better. I just shifted that over one frame by selecting that key and then holding Shift and the middle mouse button to click and drag that left to right in the timeline. Now the reason I'm holding Shift is because I don't want to change the value, so I'm not holding Shift right now, and I'm just middle mouse clicking and dragging. But if I hold Shift, middle mouse click and drag, you can see that it's not changing the value, it's not changing the vertical position, it's only changing the timing. So stretching. Let's add a fourth ball here. So we can see this ball is stretching as it rises and then stretching again as it falls. Now there's two kind of ways that we can think about squash and stretch here. First of all, the low part of the ball, I've started to animate this bottom controller here. On the second frame of the animation, which just happens to be frame 1 in the timeline here because it starts at 0, but it's the second frame of the animation, what I've done is I've taken that lower control and I've actually animated it back down to touch the floor. So it used to be here, but I want it to sort of seem like that lower controller is a foot and it's pushing the rest of the ball up. It's kicking it up. So I've animated that down to stay on the ground. You could also, the other way to think about this, you could also think of it like follow-through. Like the middle and the top part of the ball have already started moving up, but the bottom part of the ball is lagging behind. It takes longer for it to get off the ground. So you could think of it like it's a foot pushing up, or that it's something lagging behind. Same as when it's falling. So as it's picking up speed, it's going to stretch more and more, and you can kind of have it start stretching earlier or later, depending on what you like visually. But again, you could think of it like the top part of the ball is lagging behind, it's following through, or you could think of it like the lower part of the ball is anticipating where it's going to land. So again, if this is a character with legs, the legs would stretch out so that they would hit first, so the feet would hit the ground first, and then the rest of the body follows through. So again, this top controller in this ultimate ball rig, it's not being animated until it hits the ground, then it's still got momentum and it's pushing down and then eventually resetting. So we'll play that back at speed. So one very common mistake that people make is actually what I'm calling pre-squashing. So if we look at this ball here, play this back, you can kind of see that as it's falling, it's not stretching, there is no stretch here, we just left that behind, but as it's falling, it's actually squashing itself before it hits the ground. It's almost like it's anticipating squashing. So the issue here is that the top control had a key set for the top position when the ball is at its peak. So this is the main controller for the ball. It's at its peak position at the height. This top control has a key there, which is fine, except that as the ball falls and eventually gets to the squashed position, the top part of the ball is already moving down into the ball. It's already squashing itself. But what we really want to happen is that that ball should, unless it's stretching, the ball should maintain its shape until the bottom of the ball hits the ground. And in fact, it might look better if this top controller isn't moving down until one frame after that ball hits the ground, after the bottom of the ball hits the ground, and then it can squash itself. So this is going to feel better. Whereas before, it was already squashing itself before it even hits the ground. Now this is something that we'll see a lot with people that are getting started with 3D animation. And again, the idea is that you've got these keys, you're working with those first, that's right. It's just like key drawings in 2D animation. But you have to be really conscious about what anticipation and follow-through means and what it looks like. So we're following through too early. We're squashing too early. Okay, the last thing I'm going to look at is a ball that isn't moving just straight up and down, but a ball that has some lateral movement. So here we've got an example where this ball is jumping from left to right. So the bottom control, for our ultimate ball rig, on the second frame of the animation, it's pushing off. So I've animated that back down. So here's what it looks like without those keys. But I've taken that control and I've animated it back down. I've keyed it down lower. So it looks like it's pushing off. It's a foot pushing off. Or it's lagging behind just a little bit. Eventually the vertical position of this bottom controller levels out. So we can see the Y curve levels out pretty quickly. But what I'm also changing here is the lateral position, the left to right position, which in this case happens to be the Z-axis. So it's not staying put. And the idea is that as the main controller hits the top position, the foot, as I'm thinking of it in this case, starts to move even more to the right to anticipate where it's going to land. So I've started to key this just a little bit more to the right, and then of course I'm also stretching it down, so I'm keying it down until it hits that floor. And then I'm just going to go through basically frame by frame and make sure that I'm really happy with, first of all, the left to right position, but then also making sure that it's touching the ground exactly in the way that I want. Then when it hits the ground, I start again to animate this top control so that it squashes down, but I'm not just moving it vertically in this case. I'm trying to keep track of the fact that this ball also has left to right momentum. So when it hits the ground, this sort of foot anticipates hitting the ground, the top follows through, pushing down, all that weight moving down, but it's also moving to the right just a little bit. I could exaggerate that. Position sort of resets itself. You can feel that here, that momentum, that weight, pushing it down, squashing it down, but also just a little bit to the right, like it's still following through slightly to the right. Okay, so hopefully that helps answer some questions, covers a few things that a lot of people are running into. Are any of these balls touching the ground? No. Sweet.